He came to the gate on a morning in April when the apple trees inside the walled garden were just beginning to throw their shadows long, and he stood there longer than a man on estate business had any reason to stand. The gate was wrought iron, old, the latch wound with a length of garden twine to keep it from lifting in the wind. Through the bars, he could see the raised kitchen beds, the espaliered pears flat against the south wall, the gravel paths worn pale and smooth by some regular pair of feet. He had expected no one. Lady Bracewell's land agent had said the kitchen garden was tended by a hired woman from the village, and Westmere had thought nothing of it, had not thought of it at all, had simply paused here on his way around the north boundary because his horse had stopped to drink from the trough at the garden wall. She was kneeling at the far end of the middle bed, her back to him, her plain dark gown spread around her knees in the soft dirt, her bare hands working something into the earth, with the unhurried patience of a person who expected no audience. She wore no bonnet. Her hair was pinned simply, the dark mass of it low at her nape, a few strands loosened by the work. He watched her. He was aware that he watched her in a way that was not incidental. And still he did not move. She turned to reach for a clay pot beside her knee. Her profile caught the morning light, the line of her cheek, the particular set of her jaw, which he would have known in a darker year and across a longer distance than this. He put his hand on the gate's iron bar and held it there. He did not lift the twine. He did not speak. He stood until his horse finished drinking, and then he walked on around the boundary, and the blood in his chest was doing something that had no name in the vocabulary available to the Earl of Westmere. If you have not yet left a thought in the quiet below this story, it would mean something to know that you are here. She has been waiting a long time to be seen. So have we all. It was a year to the week since the carriage had gone into the Avon. Dorothea Vane had been 23 years old, and 8 months into a situation she had not chosen and could not leave. The eldest surviving child of a gentleman who had died leaving behind her. 2 younger sisters now safely in the care of a maternal aunt in Shrewsbury, a library of modest volumes, and debts that her Uncle Edmund had spent the better part of the following year converting into leverage. The arrangement with Mr. Selwyn Crabbe had been presented to her as a solution. It was not a solution. It was a transaction, and she was the article being sold. And she had known this with a clarity that her uncle's careful language could not quite obscure, though he had tried. She had not intended to survive the carriage going into the river. She had intended only to be inside it when it crossed the flooded bridge at Hartwell, and then to be on the other side of what came next, wherever that might be. What she had not intended was that the carriage would tip rather than sink, that she would find herself in 4 feet of water rather than 12, that the cold would fix her hands around a wheel, spoke and hold her there, while the current took her shawl and her bonnet, and her uncle's illusions about her docility. She had walked 3 miles in a wet gown to a farmhouse, and she had given the farmer's wife a false name, and she had spent 6 weeks in a state of something close to stillness while she decided what came next. What came next was Lady Constance Bracewell, 61 years old, a widow of independent means and an independent disposition, who had been her father's neighbor in Berkshire 30 years before she moved to Wiltshire, and who had never much cared for Edmund Vane. Lady Bracewell had arrived at the farmhouse on the pretext of purchasing a particular hen, and she had looked at the young woman sitting very still by the kitchen window, under the name of Mrs. Heath, and she had said quietly that the young woman's father had the same jaw, and that she was welcome to come away somewhere safer if she wished. That had been 11 months ago. Dorothea had become Mrs. Heath in truth, or as much truth as the village required, and she had tended Lady Bracewell's kitchen garden and read aloud to the elderly companion, Miss Gilmore, who was quite deaf, and smiled at the motion of lips rather than the sense of words, and she had told herself each month that the month after this one she would write to her sisters, and she had not yet written. The court had spent a year in something that approximated mourning. She knew this from Lady Bracewell, who received correspondence from London and who read pieces of it aloud over dinner with the particular tone of a woman amused by the machinery she has stepped outside. A lady in London, whose name Lady Bracewell spoke with the precise neutrality reserved for people she found tiring, had made something of the occasion. The woman was one whose social authority rested on the quality of the stories she circulated, and the story of the Earl of Westmere mourning the girl he had never publicly claimed was a story with certain pleasures in it, and she had told it well. "She has called you his mourning fantasy," Lady Bracewell said one evening, setting down a letter and reaching for her wineglass. "His mourning fantasy. One does have to admire the efficiency. She has made you both pitiful and romantic in under 3 words." Dorothea had listened to this with her hands folded in her lap and her face very still, and said nothing. The Earl of Westmere. She had known him, in the way that neighboring families know one another across a county. Not well, not intimately, but specifically. She knew his silences were attentive rather than cold. She knew he had a younger sister he was careful about, and a library he used rather than displayed. She knew that at the Harton Assembly, the winter before her father died, he had asked her twice to dance, when once would have been sufficient, and that both times he had not filled the silence between them with the conversation the other gentlemen used to fill it, and that she had liked him for the silence more than she could have explained. She had not expected to encounter him here. Lady Bracewell had not warned her. Lady Bracewell's land agent had sent a note that the Earl of Westmere's solicitor required a boundary answer regarding the pasture edge, and that the Earl himself would call in person on Friday to spare the solicitor a journey. And Lady Bracewell had read this note and not passed it to Dorothea, which in retrospect Dorothea thought was somewhat deliberate. He arrived at 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon. She was in the hall when he was admitted, having come in from the garden to wash her hands, and she heard his voice before she heard his name, and went still against the wall. She composed herself in the time it took the footman to cross to the morning room door. She arranged her face into the face of Mrs. Heath, which was a useful face, quiet and industrious, and belonging to no one of interest. She was in the doorway before Lady Bracewell called her in, because she had understood by then that to hesitate was to be found hesitating, and there was nothing more legible than a person trying not to be seen. He was standing at the window when she entered. He turned. He was taller than she remembered, or she had simply not stood this close to him before. His dark coat was travel-worn at the sleeve. His eyes, which were the particular gray of a sky about to produce weather, moved to her face and stayed there for 1 full second before they moved away. He said nothing that acknowledged her. She said nothing that acknowledged him. Lady Bracewell introduced them, and he said good afternoon in a voice that was level and gave nothing away. And she said my lord in a voice that she was fairly sure was also level. And they sat to tea, and he discussed the boundary survey for 20 minutes. And she poured, and not once did she spill. It was only when he stood to go that she caught the slight tension at his jaw, the way his hand went to the inside breast of his coat for the briefest moment, as though to confirm something was there, and then drew back. He knew. She was as certain of it as she was certain of her own hands, and yet he had given her nothing, had taken nothing from her, and she did not know if the knowing would make him act. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the narrow bed in the room off the kitchen garden and watched the ceiling and thought about whether he would speak, and whether speaking would mean her discovery, and whether discovery would mean her uncle, and whether her uncle would mean Crab. She thought also about the look he had not given her, which was a more careful thing than any look he had. He returned 2 days later on the pretext of a second survey question his land agent had supposedly overlooked. She was in the kitchen garden. She did not know he was there. She was reading aloud to old Miss Gilmore, who was seated in a wooden chair in the mild afternoon sun with her eyes closed and a small smile on her face. The garden gate between them was locked. She did not know he had come around the north wall to stand at it. Did not feel his stillness at the bars while she turned a page and read on. She was in the middle of a passage about a woman who had walked all the way across a county to deliver a letter and found the door locked when she arrived, and she read it slowly so Miss Gilmore could feel the shape of the words in the air, and the old woman could not hear a syllable. But she smiled anyway, her face tipped toward the warmth, and the whole of it was simply for the sake of the woman in the chair, who got nothing from it but the comfort of a person's presence and the motion of lips that looked kind. He stood at the locked gate and watched her for 4 minutes. He was precise about this afterward, in his own accounting. 4 minutes was the length of time it took him to understand that the unsigned letter in his breast pocket, the one he had written and held for 3 days and not sent because he had told himself it was presumptuous, the one he had been carrying for 14 months as a form of self-administered punishment, was not simply a record of his failure. It was a debt still owed. He left before she saw him. He stood at the gate a moment longer than leaving required, his hand on the iron bar the way it had rested in April, and he thought about the letter in his breast pocket. And he thought about the woman who read aloud to someone who could not hear her, and he decided that both of those things were part of the same problem, which was that he had too long allowed the possible to be defeated by the precise. He had nothing yet to offer that was sufficient, and he knew it, and he left anyway because sometimes the only honest thing is to leave and come back better prepared. He bent and pressed a small stem of forget-me-not through the lowest bar of the gate, where it would lie on the gravel path, and he walked back to his horse. She found it that afternoon when she locked the gate for the evening. A single stem, the blue flowers very small and slightly crushed at the tip from passing through the iron. She held it in her palm for a long time, and then she pressed it inside the back cover of the volume she had been reading, and she did not let herself think about who had left it, because thinking about it required conclusions she was not yet ready to reach. The following week, Lady Bracewell proposed a survey of the orchard boundary, which Dorothea suspected was contrived. She was correct. Lord Westmere arrived at 10 in the morning, and Lady Bracewell announced she was indisposed and would Mrs. Heath accompany his lordship, and Dorothea looked at the old woman's entirely unindisposed expression and agreed. They walked the orchard in silence for some time. The trees were past blossom and moving into early leaf, the fruit just beginning to set, small and hard, and unpromising in the way that things are before they become what they will be. He walked with his hands behind his back. She walked with her hands folded before her. The social distance between them was correct, and neither of them pretended it was comfortable. The morning was cool and still, the kind of morning that held sound strangely well, and she was aware of each step on the grass, of the slight difference in their pace, of the fact that he matched his stride to hers rather than requiring her to match hers to his, which she noticed and thought she ought not to notice. A thrush was doing something complex in the apple tree to her left. Somewhere beyond the wall, the groundskeeper's boy was whistling, and then he was not. She waited for him to speak her name. He did not. He walked the length of the south wall, counting his steps in a way that suggested no interest in the count, and she let him, because she had learned in the past year that the right kind of patience was not passive, but deliberate, and that a man who had kept a secret for a week in a county where secrets did not keep would say what he needed to say when they were sufficiently far from the house. He stopped at the stone wall where the orchard met the meadow, and he reached inside his coat, and he took out an envelope. He did not offer it to her. He held it so she could see the outside of it, his arm at his side, the letter angled toward her with a quietness that was almost diffident, which was a quality she had not previously associated with the Earl of Westmere. Her name was on the front. Her real name, in his hand, the ink faded to the color of old tea. 3 syllables set down with the care of a man who had written them more than once in his thoughts before he wrote them on paper. The date in the upper left corner was the 14th of February, 1814. The accident had been on the 17th. She understood what this meant. It meant he had written before. It meant whatever was inside had been written before she vanished, before the court's mourning, before the year of his carrying it, and that he had not sent it. She did not know what it said. She did not need to know. She knew what it meant that he had not sent it, and she knew what it meant that he was showing it to her now, standing in a Wiltshire orchard in April with his jaw set and his eyes on the middle distance rather than her face. "I was too slow," he said. His voice was even, but she heard what was under it, which was not even at all. It was the voice of a man who had rehearsed a different kind of conversation and found himself standing in the wrong location for it, which was to say the location where the actual conversation had to be had, regardless of preparation. She did not reach for the envelope. She looked at it for a long moment, at the faded ink of her own name in his hand, at the date in the corner, at the slight creasing of the envelope that meant it had been folded and unfolded more than once in the month since he wrote it. And she thought about what it cost to carry something you should have sent. She thought she understood something about that. She had been carrying her father's rosemary sprig for 14 months without knowing exactly why, and she understood now that there were things one kept, not because they were useful, but because setting them down felt like admitting something one was not yet ready to admit. She looked at his face, and she said, "You are here now." He put the letter back inside his coat. He said, "Yes." They walked back to the house, and the social distance between them was still correct, and something underneath it had shifted in the way that orchard walls shift in spring, almost imperceptibly, but by enough. The woman from London arrived on a Thursday, unannounced, which was her preferred method of arrival, as it maximized the information available to a careful observer in the first 5 minutes of a visit. Lady Westhall said she was passing on her way to Bath and had simply stopped to call, which Dorothea understood to mean she had been in Wiltshire for 3 days, and had called on 4 households and assembled a picture, and that the picture had something in it that required closer examination. She came into Lady Bracewell's drawing room with the particular air of a woman who has arranged the room to her preference before entering it. She was dressed in pale yellow, a color that required a specific kind of confidence, and she had it. She kissed Lady Bracewell's cheek and sat down and looked around the room with the practiced efficiency of someone cataloging contents. Her eyes passed over Dorothea and moved on, and then moved back. Lord Westmere was there. He had been there an hour before the guest arrived, reading in the window seat while Lady Bracewell worked her needlework, and Dorothea sat at the writing desk composing a letter she still did not send. He had been there often enough in the past week that Lady Bracewell's housekeeper had taken to setting a 4th cup without being asked. She smiled at Lord Westmere and said that she had heard he was spending time in the country, and that one had hoped Bath might tempt him, but that she could see he had found a different kind of comfort. He said, "Good afternoon," and nothing else. She looked at Dorothea again. The look was longer this time, the particular quality of attention that meant a woman was searching her own catalogue and finding a match. She turned back to Lord Westmere with the gracious air of someone reporting a compliment, and said that she had only just been speaking of him in London. That Lady Pembridge had asked after him. That they had thought perhaps the year's mourning might have softened him to the season, that he might be ready to put aside his mourning fantasy and attend the spring assemblies. She said the words lightly, with warmth, as though the phrase were a kindness. She said that they had hoped poor Miss Vane had haunted him long enough. A pleasant girl, of course. She had always been only a mourning fantasy. The room was quiet. The fire made a small sound. Lord Westmere looked from their guest to Dorothea, and Dorothea stood at the writing desk with her back very straight and her face arranged into the face of Mrs. Heath. He said nothing. She felt it in her chest, the nothing. Felt it the way she had felt the cold of the river in February, as a specific and total thing, and she thought, here it is. Here is the shape of it, the shape she had known was possible, had always known was possible, and had spent 11 months pretending not to anticipate. She was still watching her. She had that look now that meant the catalogue match had become a certainty, and she was deciding what to do with the certainty. And that decision, Dorothea could see, was going to be made in a room with witnesses. She excused herself. She went out into the hall. She heard Lady Bracewell say something light and deflecting, and she heard Lord Westmere say nothing at all, and she went to the kitchen garden and stood with her back against the wall in the cool air and pressed her hands together until they were steady. He did not follow her. She had not expected him to. The thing about a year's practice at surviving was that it did not make the surviving comfortable. It made it precise. She was very good at it by now. She could pack her small bag in 12 minutes. She had done it 3 times in 11 months, false alarms each one, and she knew where every item lived. 4 days after the Thursday visit, she heard the carriage on the gravel at 10:30 in the morning. She was in the garden. She heard the voices, and she recognized one of them without needing to look. She had not heard her Uncle Edmund's voice in 14 months. It had not grown softer. She stayed in the garden. She listened to the house through the open kitchen window. She heard Lady Bracewell's greeting, which was the formal greeting she used for people she was not pleased to receive. She heard a second voice, thinner and higher, and knew it for Selwyn Crabbe without needing to see him. An hour later, a footman passed through the kitchen yard on his way to the stable, talking under his breath to the kitchen maid, and the kitchen maid laughed, and the footman said that the visitor from London had told some cousin about the companion, and the cousin had come to press the matter, and that the visitor had said it was no great surprise. The woman was always just Westmere's mourning fantasy, walking around Wiltshire in a gardening apron. The kitchen maid laughed again. They passed out of earshot. Dorothea set down the hand trowel. She walked into the kitchen. She went to the cupboard where she kept her bag, and she took it down, and she opened it and looked at its contents. And then she closed it again and stood very still with her hands on the clasp. She had asked nothing of any of them. She had asked nothing of Lady Bracewell beyond the shelter of a name and a room, and she would not ask more than that. If she was discovered, and Crabbe pressed his arrangement, whatever legal question that arrangement raised would press against Lady Bracewell too, against this house, against the housekeeper and the kitchen maid, and old Miss Gilmore in her garden chair. She had survived the river. She could survive Crabbe and Edmund if she walked out the garden gate herself, and gave them nothing to threaten the house with. She lifted her bag. She took from the narrow shelf above the hearth the pressed sprig of rosemary from her father's last letter, which she had carried since before the accident, a small brown thing that had once been fragrant and green. She placed it in her coat pocket. She went to find Lady Bracewell. The drawing-room held her uncle, Crabbe, Lord Westmere, Lady Bracewell, and Lady Bracewell's solicitor, a thin man named Mr. Alderton, who had been summoned from the village and who stood near the window with the expression of a man who wished he were elsewhere. The woman who had come on Thursday was not present. She had gone to Bath, her errand apparently complete. Her uncle turned when she came in. His face did the calculation she had watched it do 100 times, the rapid inventory of how things stood and how they might be moved. He said her name. Crabbe said nothing. He looked at her with the flat assessment of a man determining value. She stood at the door, and she did not look at Lord Westmere, because looking at him required a composure she was rationing, and she said to Mr. Alderton that she understood there was a legal question, and that she intended to resolve it simply. That she was Miss Dorothea Vane, not deceased, and that she was prepared to sign whatever document established that fact, and that she would accompany her uncle and Mr. Crabbe that afternoon and settle the matter without bringing further inconvenience to Lady Bracewell. Her uncle began to speak. Lady Bracewell began to speak. She was looking at Mr. Alderton, and not at either of them. Lord Westmere crossed the room. He crossed it in 3 strides, and he stood between her and the door, and he turned to face her uncle and Crabbe with the quality of stillness he had, which was not empty, but the opposite of empty, which was the stillness of something containing a great deal at high pressure. Miss Vane is alive, and she is under my protection. The room held that sentence for a moment. The fire was quiet. Mr. Alderton took a small step back. He reached inside his coat. He produced the envelope with her name on the outside, and he placed it on Lady Bracewell's writing desk. And he turned to Mr. Alderton and spoke plainly. The date on the letter was the 14th of February, 1814, 3 days before the carriage accident. The contents were a formal offer of marriage. Any prior arrangement pressed by her uncle, or any obligation claimed by Mr. Crabbe, postdated that letter, and was therefore superseded by it. He would require confirmation. Mr. Alderton adjusted his spectacles. He looked at the envelope. He looked at the uncle, who was looking at Lord Westmere with the expression of a man whose best road has just been closed. He looked at Crabbe, who was looking at the envelope. Mr. Alderton said that he would require to examine the contents, and that on the face of it, if the date and the contents were as described, then yes, a prior claim of that nature with those witnesses would supersede any subsequent arrangement not formalized as a legal contract. There was an understanding, the uncle said. There was a letter, Lord Westmere said. Examine it, Alderton. There was a silence in which Mr. Alderton read. Crabbe said, into that silence, the thing that practical men say, which was about the question of recovery of costs, and Lady Bracewell said, in the voice she reserved for that particular register of claim, that any question of costs could be directed to her own solicitor in London, and she named the solicitor, and the name was sufficient. Dorothea had not moved from the doorway. She was watching Lord Westmere's back, the set of his shoulders, the way he did not turn to check whether she was still there. He knew she was there. She understood this the same way she understood the garden in early morning, by a quality of attention in the air that did not require looking. She was also understanding several other things in rapid succession, among them that he had written to her before she disappeared, that he had written and not sent, and that he had carried the letter for 14 months and then had used it as a weapon on her behalf in a drawing room in Wiltshire with her uncle in the room, which was possibly the most Adrian Corville thing he could have done, the most complete and characteristic expression of a man who had always known exactly what mattered and had needed time, and one specific crisis, to say so. She felt something shift in her chest, the way a locked gate shifts when the twine finally frays. Her uncle and Crabbe left within the hour. The departure was not gracious, but it was final. Mr. Alderton made his notes and followed them at a tactful distance. Lady Bracewell rang for tea, and then went to speak to her housekeeper about it for far longer than the tea required, in the manner of a woman making a diplomatic disappearance. Lord Westmere was standing at the window when Dorothea came fully into the room. She had set her bag down in the hall. She had not thought, quite yet, about where to put it instead. He turned. The late afternoon was coming through the window at an angle that caught the planes of his face in the way she had noticed before. The jaw, the slight tension at the corner of his mouth that meant he was managing something closely. His hands were at his sides, and he looked at her with no social register at all, which was to say, he looked at her simply, which was something she had not had for a very long time from anyone who knew her name. She said, "You should have sent it." He said, "Yes." She said, "I would have answered you." He stood still for a moment. "I know," he said. The words were slow and plain. "I worked that out at approximately the moment I heard you had drowned." His voice carried what was underneath it, which was not evenness at all. It was the voice of a man who had rehearsed none of this, because the version of this conversation he had rehearsed had not had her alive in it. "I have been carrying a conversation we did not have for 14 months. "I know," she said. He said her name. He said Miss Vane, and then he said Dorothea, the way she had sometimes heard him say nothing, which was with a great deal of intention underneath it, the way a man says a word when he has been waiting to say it for longer than he means to admit. "I am asking you now," which is later than I should have asked, and with less grace than I had planned when I was 22, and had opinions about how one did these things. "I am asking." She looked at him. She thought about the river and the farmhouse and the kitchen garden and the 11 months of being Mrs. Heath and the locked gate and the forget-me-not pressed inside the back cover of her book. She said, "Yes." He put his hand out. She took it. It was a formal thing. The handshake of agreement, his glove over hers, the period's appropriate gesture, and then it did not stop at appropriate, because he did not release her hand, and she did not pull back. And they stood there in Lady Bracewell's afternoon drawing room, simply holding on while the fire quietly burned. The room smelled of tea and old wood, and the faint green scent of garden that had followed her inside on her apron. And the fire was warm, and his hand was steady. She did not want him to let go. She was aware with great precision of not wanting him to let go, which was a feeling she had not had in some time for anything or anyone, and which arrived now with the particular weight of things that have been postponed past their natural season and arrive late with all their force intact. The fire was warm. His hand was steady. Outside the window, the evening was beginning to come on, the light going amber over the kitchen garden wall, and the gate was there, the iron gate with the twine coiled on the post, standing unlocked as it had not stood for 11 months, and she could see it from where she stood, and she did not look away from it. 3 weeks later, she went to the garden at 6 in the morning when the light was just beginning to level across the beds, the kind of light that comes in spring and is already warm despite the hour, the kind that makes the dew on the rosemary catch and hold for a moment before it dissolves, The birds were at their full morning volume. The kitchen cat was sitting on the south wall watching something in the grass with the focused patience of creatures that have no difficulty with waiting. The espaliered pears against the south wall had put out their small leaves in the weeks since April, and the whole of it was green and ordinary, and hers. The gate was unlocked. It had been unlocked for a week. She had told Lady Bracewell's gardener he could leave it so, and every morning when she came out she found it standing slightly open, the twine coiled on the post beside it, and she had not told anyone what that meant to her, which was something she thought she might not have words for and might not need. He was there already. He did this sometimes, arrived before she expected him, stood at the garden wall with his coat on and his hands in his pockets, watching the pear trees or the rosemary or the particular quality of the early hour. He was not a man who required an occupation to justify standing somewhere, and she had come to find this restful in a way she had not anticipated, the way that one finds restful any presence that requires nothing of you but your own naturalness. She went to the rosemary bed and cut a sprig. She crossed the garden and held it out to him. He looked at it. He knew what it meant, because she had told him about her father's letters, about the sprigs her father pressed into the folds before sealing them, the way she had always known when a letter was from him before she opened it, by the dry green scent through the paper. He had listened to her tell him this in a way that meant he would not forget it. He took the sprig from her hand. His fingers were cold from the morning air, and hers were warm from the work. And the contrast was something she registered in her wrist and her forearm, and the particular nerve under her collarbone that had been registering him since April. She reached into her pocket and took out the letter. His letter, the one with her name on the outside in his faded hand, the date in the corner 3 days before the accident. She held it back to him, unopened. He looked at her. "I know what it says," she said. "You have already said it. I was there." He took the letter. He looked at it for a moment, and then he did something she had not expected, which was that he turned it over and broke the seal himself, and he read it quietly, standing in the morning garden with the rosemary in his other hand. She watched his face while he read, the particular stillness of it, and then a quality that moved across the stillness like light, moving across still water, brief and unmistakable. He folded the letter and held it at his side. "It was a better letter than I remembered," he said. "I am sure it was. I said I admired your judgment more than anyone I had met in 5 years of seasons." He looked at her steadily. "That is a reasonably specific compliment," she said. "I meant it specifically." His voice had something in it that was almost not solemn, which on him was significant. "I also said that if you were willing to be rather unconventionally asked by a man standing in an orchard who is aware he has left it later than anyone sensible would, I would very much like to know what you think of apple trees in early morning." She looked around the garden. The apple trees were past the orchard wall, but the morning was the same morning. The light was the same light. And she was standing in the kitchen beds she had tended for 11 months under a borrowed name, and the gate behind her stood open, and she was herself, her real self alive. The name she had carried under a borrowed one for 11 months returned to her in full. "I think they are better with company," she said. He put the letter in his coat pocket. He put the rosemary in beside it. She watched him do this, and she thought about how the rosemary would scent the letter, and the letter would hold the scent, and that the two of them would sit together in his coat pocket like things that had always belonged in the same place, which was perhaps a somewhat sentimental observation. And she made it anyway. And the morning was warm enough now that she could feel it on her hands. He held his hand out, and she put hers into it. and they stood together in the kitchen garden, while the morning came on, and the birds found their volume, and the espaliered pears against the south wall caught the first real warmth of the day. The gate stood open behind them, the twine coiled on the post. The gravel path was smooth and pale where her feet had worn it. She had survived the river. She had survived 14 months of a borrowed name and a locked gate, of being a person the court was spending its grief on while she weeded kitchen beds in Wiltshire. She had walked out the door herself rather than wait to be removed, which was the one thing she had always been able to do, the one thing that had not required anyone else's help or permission. And here was the morning, and the open gate, and the man standing beside her with a sprig of rosemary and an unsent letter that had arrived. In the end, at exactly the right moment and in exactly the right hand. All of it ordinary, all of it precisely enough. If Dorothea's quiet courage moved you, leave a word below. Thank you for staying at the gate with her until it opened.